I'm Elise.
And I'm Bianca. We are two former federal prosecutors, mothers, and lawyers here to decode Project 2025. We're bringing you the subject matter and agency experts who can speak to the proposal's real-life implications.
For those who've not heard of the Project 2025, it was developed by the Heritage Foundation, which was founded in the 1970s and played a leading role in the conservative movement of the 1980s. The Heritage Foundation largely shaped the Reagan agenda, and the foundation reportedly now seeks to set the agenda for the next Republican president.
The proposal is nearly 1,000 pages and would vastly change our federal government, but more importantly, it will have significant impact on the daily lives of Americans. If you haven't read it, don't worry, we got you. And today, we'll be breaking down the sections of the Department of Justice. Elise, do you want to introduce our guest?
Absolutely do. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Lou Manzo, who is our former colleague. We all worked together at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia years ago. More recently, Lou worked as a trial attorney in the fraud section of the Department of Justice. But I think most relevantly for this conversation, Lou was one of the lead prosecutors on the Oathkeepers cases. And for those viewers who don't recall, those were the cases that resulted in the convictions of seditious conspiracy charges for the January 6th insurrectionists. So happy to have you here today, Lou, and you are the right person to help break down this chapter on our beloved Department of Justice. But if you could use one word to describe this chapter and all of its proposals, what would it be?
Good question. And thanks for having me, Elise and Bianca. I'd have to say apocalyptic. The words that they use in the chapter on Project 2025 as they describe the Department of Justice, they keep saying that the DOJ has been taken over, and that means FBI and all the federal law enforcement agencies have been taken over by far left ideologues. And they use super aggressive apocalyptic language to say that there's a crisis and that the government and DOJ needs a radical takeover. So it's a very different policy paper than you'd ever see in kind of a normal Republican administration.
Yeah, I love that word apocalyptic. And, you know, throughout the course of the proposal, there's all this language that accuses the Biden administration and other Democratic administrations of weaponizing the Department of Justice and just going after political adversaries and things like that. And it really just brought me back to my time at DOJ, which overlapped with you all, where what felt like the most unprecedented politicization and weaponization of the DOJ, which was the Roger Stone matter, right? We can remember back in February 2020, all of a sudden there were line prosecutors who made a recommendation. Line prosecutors handled the case through trial, knew every fact, made their sentencing recommendation complicit with the sentencing guidelines. And then suddenly DOJ steps in and says, wait a second, these guidelines are too harsh for this rich ally of the current president. They're usually just fine for everyone else, particularly on the violent crime side. But that felt like weaponization and really politicizing the DOJ. What are your reactions to the sentiments throughout the proposal about the allegations regarding weaponization?
Yeah, so there's two main thrusts of the Project 2025 policy paper as it relates to DOJ. And one is policy, and then the other is personnel. So maybe we can start with the personnel side, because that ended up affecting the Roger Stone prosecution, where prosecutors quit and left the department or got off the case because they thought the case was so politicized. So one thing that there's a feeling amongst the Heritage Foundation is that the first Trump administration was not conservative enough. They didn't have the right personnel involved to actually implement the policies that they wanted to. So Project 2025 is this kind of overarching statement where they're trying to pull in conservative attorneys who are from not traditional backgrounds to serve in the administration. So a lot of times there are kind of big law, white-shoed attorneys that will come in and serve in the Republican administration. And that was a lot of what happened in the first Trump administration. And now it's seen as that these people were not conservative enough. They did not implement the president's agenda. So we need to go outside of mainstream channels and try and find attorneys from anywhere who can staff DOJ to implement this kind of radical agenda. And so that means going out and sitting at tables at state fairs, anywhere you can, to try and find attorneys who will implement this agenda that they've set out. So if policy is personnel. That's the first thing that Project 2025, as it relates to DOJ, is saying that, hey, we need to get people outside of the normal conservative channels to come in and staff DOJ.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. What would that mean practically? Like for those who have not worked inside of the government and aren't as close to what can happen if, certain people get that job, right, and have prosecutorial discretion. What do you think the practical implication of that would be?
Yeah. So, from our time in government, we served in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, across three administrations. And 99% of the federal government are civil servants just doing their job, going to work every day, and they don't have political agendas. And we worked with law enforcement agents, the vast majority of whom were very conservative people, but they're just there doing their job. The work of the federal government is fundamentally nonpartisan 99.9% of the time. And one of the things that Project 2025 is doing is that they're trying to change the positions of attorneys at DOJ and the positions of law enforcement and making it ostensibly political. So this is something called Schedule F. So now there are people who, as we were, civil servants, and we have protections under federal law that, we just kind of do our job and we aren't liable to get prosecuted or get fired by the president because we're not implementing a certain agenda. Project 2025 would make larger parts of DOJ and the FBI subject to political appointees. So basically, anyone can get fired if they're not implementing the exact thing the president wants. And when you combine that with the new Supreme Court ruling, where it said basically, where the Supreme Court said, hey, President, you have huge authority to execute your agenda and very little oversight from any other body. It creates a system where the civil servants that make up the whole guts of the federal government and have all the arrest powers and prosecution powers go from serving the Constitution to going to serve the whims of the president. And that can be anything. And so it's kind of a radical shift in how we organize ourselves as a country.
For abuse too, right? If you're just doing the will of one person.
Right. Yeah. And it could change, and it can change from administration to administration. So it would create a potential zigzag of agendas that radically shifts with every administration. Or if there's an administration that's powerful enough to harness this and fires and then rehires, attorneys to implement kind of radical agendas, and Project 2025 gets into that. And we can talk about that in a couple minutes about immigration, abortion, that it could potentially forever change the country. So the move from civil servants that have protections to this new Schedule F would have kind of dramatic changes in not only how the federal government functions, but in how the government would function, into the future.
Right. You mentioned abortion, so let's talk about that a little bit. One of the things that is referred to quite a bit in the DOJ proposal is the FACE Act. And there's this idea of the Biden administration being sort of selective and biased in terms of the pursuit of cases that involve sort of interference and intimidation outside of abortion clinics, less so in terms of pregnancy care units and things like that. Did you have any reaction to that section of the proposal?
I don't personally have a lot of knowledge about that, but I would say this, that every time there's an accusation that DOJ is being politicized, it's very convenient to talk about that the president's own son is already been convicted and is on trial again coming up. And Senator Menendez has been convicted in New Jersey, and he's a Democrat. So there is very ample evidence that the work of the department is continuing on in a completely non-biased way. There are Democrats being prosecuted for fraud. There are Republicans being prosecuted for fraud. Both sides are being prosecuted for corruption. And so there just isn't really any evidence that DOJ has been politicized. And so when Project 2025 points to these kind of, statements, they really lack any evidence to back those up.
Yeah. Say that again for the people in the back, right? Because I think that is quintessentially one of the issues with it. It just because it's in writing doesn't make it true. So one of the pieces that caught my attention was the claim that violent crime is on the rise nationwide. We know
100%. Exactly.
Right? We know that crime has fallen from, it's close to pre-pandemic levels. We know that there are some outliers, but on the whole scope of the nation, violent crime is not on the rise.
100%. And people do not realize that because it's easy to look at anecdotal evidence where it's like, oh, there was a shooting or there was this terrible crime. You know, and we all want to live in a crime-free society. But if you look at the statistics, crime is dropping dramatically under the Biden administration. And so if Project 2025 makes this out to be that we are in a hellhole and the cities are falling apart, but what the evidence is showing is kind of the exact opposite. So again, it's statement policies that are not backed up by actual evidence.
Yeah, and I just want to read something real quick, Bianca, to your point, because there's a lot of talk about this weaponization of the Department of Justice with respect to Democrat administrations and, you know, all the points you just pointed out. But at the beginning of this chapter in Project 2025, the quote goes, "Not reforming the Department of Justice will also guarantee the failure of that conservative administration's agenda in countless other ways." They're basically, I mean, to me, and I want to hear your reaction, Lou, they're basically saying, we've got to implement this. We got to make these changes so we can push our conservative agenda. I mean, isn't that just teeing up the weaponization of the Department of Justice to implement the conservative agenda at all costs through these means? Is that
right?
What it means? That's
yeah.
what it means to me.
Because there's a couple of main thrusts that you see on the Heritage platform right now. It's abortion access or abortion making it illegal, and immigration. And if you want to have those policy changes succeed, where you eliminate abortion and you deport 15 million Americans, you need law enforcement to back that up. Otherwise, this is just laws without any teeth. And so when you're talking about making abortion illegal, you need federal law enforcement agents and federal prosecutors to prosecute people who are either giving abortions or who are dispensing abortion medication. And without DOJ being involved in that, the efforts to make abortion unavailable will probably fail. And what you're seeing at the local level now is that local DAs, in the couple cases that they've brought that concern abortion, have been highly controversial, because every criminal case involving abortion means that people are going to have to come forward and testify about extremely intimate details of their private lives. And there was a case in Indiana involving the child who was being forced to testify. These are things that really do not look good in the news. And so local DAs do not want to bring them. And so ultimately, Project 2025 is saying, DOJ, you're going to be the one enforcing these new anti-abortion measures. Same thing with immigration. If you want to deport 15 million people, it's not like you can just go and grab people off the street. There needs to be a legal process. So who's going to actually do that? It would have to be the Department of Justice and FBI agents working in conjunction with Homeland Security. So it'd be that's why DOJ is so central to the other agendas that that Project 2025 wants to push.
One of the things that I find most scary, in addition to what you mentioned about these proposals not necessarily being based on evidence, but when you have a policy that's not connected, where the implementation does not support the policy goal, right? This is our problem. This is what we're going to do. But there is a significant disconnect between the two. And one of the places where that jumped out to me was with respect to opioids, right? And you spent a big portion of your career in healthcare fraud, Lou, prosecuting those cases. There's a quote from the proposal that discusses prosecuting as much interstate drug crime as possible, including, quote, simple possession of distributable quantities, end quote. So I guess my question for you is, when you were working on those cases, did you find that there was substantial connection between street crime, street sales, possession, simple possession of those substances and the work that you were doing?
So it really depended. So I did a lot of overprescribing cases in opioids. So doctors that were illegally prescribing opioids beyond any kind of medical necessity. But what we saw over time was that as we became more active in those prosecutions, opioids really shifted. So people stopped using opioids and started relying more on fentanyl to kind of feed their habit. And the issue with that is fentanyl is very easily accessible through the mail. And so there is this huge thrust and demonization of I think, immigrants crossing through the southern border and fentanyl coming through the southern border. Yes, that does happen. But most fentanyl just comes through the mail. And so it is a problem for sure. But the way that Project 2025 is using immigration and tying it to fentanyl is not entirely accurate, because fentanyl can just as easily come through the mail, and huge parts of it do, because such a small amount of it can be packaged in an envelope or in a tiny package and sent from China or from any place that's producing it. So again, it's they're trying to push an agenda. They're claiming that there's evidence for it, but that evidence, if you kind of look at it a little closer, it doesn't really get backed up.
You got to be critical thinkers, people. Critical
Exactly.
Question for you, Lou. You mentioned a little while ago local DAs. It seems like 2025 has some, in this chapter, some provisions that address prosecutorial discretion, and more specifically, would like to limit prosecutorial discretion in some pretty significant ways. Could you talk a little bit about that, and what is your impression?
Yeah. So as you guys know from working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., a lot of cases that police bring in might not have the best evidence to support a prosecution. And sometimes there's good reasons for that and sometimes not. Like a couple simple examples. A big fight at a bar, right? Police might come in, arrest everyone, but no one can tell who started it, and everyone just wants to move on with their life. And so all the charges get dropped. Fine. Or if there's a gun in a car, right? And there's 4 people in the car, police might arrest everyone. But in the end, it's very unlikely that the government could prove that 4 people equally possessed a gun. Maybe you run some DNA testing or fingerprints on the gun to figure out who actually was possessing the gun, and you charge that person. But ultimately, 3 people get dismissed. So there's many reasons why when police bring cases that they don't get charged. And sometimes it's prosecutorial discretion on just what's a priority for the office. And so what you saw kind of in 2020, for better or worse, was that a lot of kind of quote unquote progressive prosecutors got elected.
Some of those of George Floyd's murder.
Exactly.
Just to remind people what we're talking about. Okay.
Right. And there's a national movement to try and correct some of the problems in the criminal justice system. And now that, crime went up and then swung down and is swinging down again, there is a backlash in many cities against some of those prosecutors. Some of them have succeeded a ton, and some of them have been pushed out. But that's kind of like the point of having local elections, is that the people that vote for a DA get to tell the DA, what to do and what priorities to make. And so what Project 2025 says is, hey, we, the federal government, are going to come in and override the DA's decision and start investigating the DA for their charging decisions. And of course, the great irony of this is that conservatives used to say, oh, we don't want federal intervention in local issues. And now Project 2025 is 100%, 180 degrees the opposite, and saying one of our platforms is going to be federal intervention in local issues. And it's just a stunning role reversal from something that would have been unthought of, 10 or 15 years ago.
Little hypocrisy there. And also very scary. I mean, we all exercised our prosecutorial discretion at one time or the other. I was actually a supervisor in the charging section. So the practical implications of what you have just described could have a chilling effect on prosecutors. And as you also described, there are very valid reasons why a prosecution is not going to go forward. So I think very important for folks to know that that's in there and what that could do to our local systems.
Yeah. So Lou, when the voters go out to the polls this year, what do you think, what in your opinion is what they need to know the most, right? What about these proposals will have the biggest impact on their day-to-day lives?
Great question. A lot of times DOJ doesn't necessarily touch your day-to-day life, right? That hopefully you're not a victim of a crime or involved in a crime, and we can all move forward and go to work, love our families, do what needs to get done. But I think when you think about the direction of the country, it's really, do you want the people who have the arrest powers and the powers to incarcerate, do you want those people to be beholden to kind of our ideals that we've built over a couple centuries in the Constitution and how it's evolved? Or do you want those people beholden to whatever the president thinks at the moment and able to just change the agenda and operate solely at the president's discretion? And that's a total change. That's a very dramatic change. And when you combine that with the Supreme Court decision, Project 2025, if implemented, and would forever shift the Department of Justice and make it more like the president's personal attorneys than attorneys representing the United States and the Constitution. So I think that's what you have to think about is do you want DOJ and also arrest powers being the president's personal attorneys, or do you want DOJ beholden to the Constitution? So I think that when you're making your decision going forward on who to vote for, that's a big thing to think about.
All right. And that's a wrap. So Lou Manzo, thank you for breaking down the DOJ provisions, for helping our listeners understand why it matters to them. And we look forward to keeping connected with you all. Join us, subscribe below, and stay tuned for more episodes of the 25th Hour.